and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lauri Murphy, and along with Susan Ginsberg, and in collaboration with EuRA, we're delighted to bring you what I hope will be an informative and enlightening session with our esteemed panel. Our topic today for discussion is creating innovation from disruption in the global workforce. To discuss this, we're joined by Jim Harris. Jim is one of North America's foremost disruptive innovation keynote speakers, author, thinker, and change in leadership. Jim is also the principal at Strategic Advantage, where he works with organizations to address issues of most concern to executives: leadership, change, customer relationship management, and creating and learning organizations. Jim is based in Toronto, Canada. Diane Whitcomb is the head of international mobility for Chanel in the US. She has worked in the mobility field for over 20 years and has previously led the mobility function at Ralph Lauren and worked in other mobility roles at Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers. Additionally, Diane has held client-facing roles with Prudential Relocation, now BGRS. Diane is based in New York. Fons Trompenaars is a Dutch organizational theorist, recognized around the world for his work as consultant, trainer, motivational speaker, and author of various books on all subjects of culture and business, including the bestseller in 1997, Riding the Waves of Culture, Understanding Cultural Diversity in Business, now in its fourth edition, which has sold over 120,000 copies and being translated into 16 languages. Fons is the CEO of THT Consulting and is based in Amsterdam. Susan Ginsberg will moderate today's session. Susan is founder and managing principal at SRG Advisory. SRG Advisory provides strategic services and value to organizations facing the uncertain world we live in. She listens and integrates company vision and objectives, helping organizations innovate to achieve business growth. Susan is based in the greater New York area. Before I hand over to Susan, I would like to make you aware that today's attendees will have the opportunity to participate in a resilience survey created by THT Consulting. This is particularly pertinent at the time we're living through. You should see the link on your screen at the start and end of today's webinar, and we will also place it in the chat box where you can access it there. Finally, we will have time for Q&A today, and if you can place them in the chat, Don from EuRA will pick them up as we go. With that, now I will hand over to Susan to moderate today's session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauri, and welcome to everybody, and a special welcome to our brilliant speakers today, as well as a big thank you, as Lauri mentioned, to Dom Tidy and EuRA Relocation. So let's dive right into some questions regarding disruption and innovation. Starting with Diane, how have you managed disruption and created innovation in your organization and within your supply chain?
Thank you. First, I'd like to say thank you, and I'm happy to be here, although a bit scary that I'm considered an expert. But, you know, it's funny because when you first sent the question of managing this disruption, I thought, who's managed this? But then I actually looked up the definition of manage, and there's a couple of ones that called out: to handle or direct with a degree of skill, or to make and keep compliant. So as everybody in global mobility knows, the compliant piece is huge, and that's what we do most of the time behind the scenes. Companies don't even know. So I guess I can say we have managed some disruption. It feels like we're managing whitewater rapids, where you don't know where the next craziness is going to come or what's around the bend of the river. And we're just using our skills as best we can to be able to adapt to these changing situations. Good examples are where we have a lot of people, well, I shouldn't say a lot. We have a couple people that we wanted to come into the US with the visa ban, and then now they have the national interest exemption. So we're trying to work around what we can do with those and travel and all those types of things to come in. And it's, we just had a plan for somebody, a French national from Brazil to the US, and then France imposed travel restrictions because they were going to have to go to Paris. So it's just really trying to figure out as it comes. We can't plan the next step because we don't know what the next step will be and look like. So we're basically trying to hope for the best, plan for the worst. And that's just really what we're just have like contingencies in the background that as of today, I sent a lot of emails, as of today, this is what we could do. Tomorrow, that might be a different situation. So, but I do think that organizations, originally I was thinking organizations that embrace flexibility, like maybe not like a Six Sigma type organization, would be more adaptable. But then after I thought about it, I thought if you have like a process where then where that kink in the process is with all this disruption, and you probably, you may be able to then plan for it a little better. Our company, very French, kind of laissez-faire. We work through things as they come up, and it's very fluid. So it kind of feels like we've been doing the same way we've acted all the way before COVID. And then I do want to bring up that, the disruption for this is not necessarily just COVID. We've had, especially in the US, we've had social injustice, we've had polarizing political issues, we've had, the election, everything else is combining with that. So I just think, and combined with the fact you're home watching the news all the time or ignoring the news all the time, as I did for a while, to be able to cope and remember that you yourself are staying safe from a, potentially deadly disease, depending on your situation. So there's a lot of emotional pieces. I think that's also tough to navigate. Because you're trying to solve real company problems when, as a retail company or partially retail company, we're thinking, is the business doing well? Am I doing well? Is my family doing well? And, oh yeah, I have to solve this problem for another family. So I think managing it is a good way to say that, so far we've been very lucky. We've gotten through things. Everybody seemed to understand. We've had one person kind of like, I can't not see my family in Paris, but we don't have control over that. But for the most part, everybody's acted well. Everybody's, drawn upon the people they need to create solutions or a plan or or a change in plan. And then, we've just gone on, and as things change, we just start all over again. And then I think with the supply chain, we're actually shifting who we're talking to. I never worked with ISOS very closely. Our immigration attorney only on cases which HR really, the HRGs really worked with. Now I'm on with Fragment every week. Trying to navigate and figure out what we can do for just even a couple people. How are we going to renew our, extend these L visas coming up this summer? The plan of attack for that, when we don't know if consulates will be open, we don't know what the travel situation will be, we don't know if the visa ban is going to stay in place. So we're not talking to the RMCs anymore, practically. We're talking to other vendors and needing solutions, and they're going through the same things we are. Like immigration, they've never had to navigate this kind of situation before. And again, you can't plan on December. We planned on somebody going to Paris, and now we can't do that. So it's just, again, global mobility is very agile and adaptable anyway. We're the person that's trying to fit the 12-inch square peg into the 6-inch round hole. So we're a little bit used to it, but it's getting everybody else on board, I think. So again, I keep saying again, but managing to me is a little bit difficult to say. We're maneuvering.
Okay, so that maneuvering, it sounds like, on a personal level, professional level, you're kind of managing through or pivoting through the various landmines, if you will, whether they're health related, whether they're socially, politically, as well as organizationally related. And it sounds like, Diane, that you're going directly to this to the supply chain in need at that time. And so, you're kind of cutting through maybe some various layers. And when you have an issue, you have a question, you have a need, you're going directly to the organization, the provider, the service partner, if you will, who can help you and pivot alongside you.
Definitely. And we're we're trying not to think too far ahead because we can't plan for anything right now. You know, we can have contingencies, like I said, you know, the plan, hope for the best, plan for the worst, so that we can have a few different ways we can navigate when we know what the landscape will look like. But right now it's just, you know, it's kind of wait, and it's, you know, we're waiting on the visa ban, and, you know, that's a big thing right now for us. And what's going to happen on March 31st? Is it going to extend? Is it going to go away? And that'll just open up so much more of what we can do and what we know. So example like that is just, you know, I keep counting the weeks. I'm like, isn't it March yet? Isn't it March yet? So
that's great, Diane.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Fons, if you would weigh in, please. Thank you.
Yeah, please. Thanks so much for being invited. Yeah, what we have been doing is two things. We have tried to digitalize our business even more. We already started a couple of years ago, and our business is helping clients with the cross-cultural challenges, mergers and acquisitions, global mobility, and what have you. And we finally found that we were beaten by the most global and mobile little thing called the virus, and it kept us as home all the time. Next to digitalization, we have written a book in English called the COVID-19 Survival Guide. And our premise was, when I was watching television, that the doctor said, oh, you have to be careful with this virus because the ICs are overwhelmed and we have too many patients. And then you got the economists saying, oh, but you have to be very careful because our economy is going down the drain. And then you have the psychiatrists saying, yeah, but especially the youth are having trouble. They commit suicide and you know, but there's nobody asking the question, what can we do with the economy that helps our health situation? And what can we do with the health situation that allows us to put the youngsters on the street again? And I'm trying to make a point, and the book is about that, is that we are so bipolar, not only in politics, in everything. You know, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And if you're a Democrat, I don't listen to you because I'm a Republican, and we are characterized by people who never listen, right? You know what I mean? And Democrats listen too much and don't act. I'm doing this out of complete lack of knowledge. But we have bipolarized the world, and that's true in the UK. And a good example of that is the referendum. The referendum, you know? And a referendum, namely, is a dilemma on which you ask people to vote. Rule number one with the dilemma, never vote on a dilemma if you go left or right, because it's a dilemma and you want both. So we said, how can we take that philosophy into COVID-19? And we found, by just reading a bit of newspapers and some articles, we came up with 24 dilemmas. And then we said, let's look what are the most important ones. So we developed this resilience app, and you were invited to fill it in. It's for free. So we especially had Dutch participants and some Scottish. Now, I'm saying this because what we have found in our research, and it's pretty remarkable, and I'll give you examples in a second, that those cultures that have reconciled the dilemmas, let me give you one example, health versus economy, are much better off than those who made a choice. And if you take Brazil and America, when you now have a new president, if I have heard the news, but there was a time that you just went for the economy, and then you have an enormous health problem. And I know cultures that went for health and have an enormous economic problem. But there are cultures who have combined the two. So if I go back to Diane's introduction, compliance, which is part apparently of management, and maneuvering or flexibility, which is perhaps part of the French. You and management and French people exclude each other. Now, what is the reconciliation? And that's asking the right questions. And that's what we did in our book, is what can we do with flexibility that increases the quality of our rules? And what can we do with our rules that give us more flexibility? If we would approach this in this way, we would have much less trouble. Now, you say, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Give me some examples. Now, we found, for example, that in your business, Diane, which is retail in the luxury goods, we found now that the luxury goods providers, like in France, but also in the Netherlands, have made face masks that are very fashionable for 60 euros a piece. And I know G-Star, who started with this in the Netherlands, a denim company, a bit like Levi's, but then G-Star, sold in one weekend 100,000 of those face masks for 60 euros. Now, what about the dilemma between health and economy? If you ask the right questions, you're in great shape. So that's what we wrote about. And we found that compliance versus flexibility, IQ versus EQ, etc., were dilemmas that nations, cultures that have reconciled them had much less excess death than those who didn't. And still on television, those who lead the programs don't ask the question, what can we do with the doctors that makes our economy better? And what can we do with the economy that makes less suicides amongst young people, rather than fighting for their arguments? And at the end, you don't know what to do. And for me, and I'm trying to build a little bridge to Jim, that is the essence of innovation. Innovation is asking the question, what can I do with value A that gives me more of value B that is opposite? And a good example, I think, is Apple. What is the dilemma of Apple? The dilemma of Apple is functionality versus aesthetics. Everything that is beautiful about an Apple is functional. So if you have the iPhone without a frame, it makes it beautiful, but it also hinders your nails to break when you swipe it, right? So beauty is made functional, which normally in the industry are separated issues. Now, Formula One, the dilemma is speed versus safety. Every engineer in Formula One at the speed driving will ask, what can we do with the speed that makes our car more safe? And aerodynamics is the way to do it. You get more downforce the faster you go. So that's what we did in the past, and we have translated it into the future. And the big dilemmas in new ways of working, we call that the recovery app. So what we're trying to do with that app is give a diagnosis. What are the dilemmas that you're facing in new ways of working? Work-life balance, digital, we call it high-tech versus high-touch, etc., etc. So it makes life beautiful. And the good news is income gradually is coming back because we couldn't travel. So you do webinars, but clients say, no, let's do it later when the corona is over. But now you say they're fed up by postponing. They say, let's do it, but then digitally. And then
it's so interesting, Fons, you know, the concept of process compliance as well as flexibility. There's the World Economic Forum, the recent Davos session about a month ago. One of the discussions was on what was called the liquid workforce. And it was all about looking at not only work-life balance and wellness, is how do organization, I won't say manage, Diane, but as they look at, kind of examine their workforce and say, okay, how do I ensure productivity, achieve my business growth goals or reemerge my organization and my business, as well as ensure that my workforce, my employees, my gig workers feel safe, connected, understand purpose. So it's that those hard kind of process, compliance driven guidelines, if you will, with the softness, if you will, of the human feeling connected, feeling like you're part of the organization's purpose. And if that liquid workforce, meaning the hybrid working model, is something to be examined and hopefully implemented in organizations as well as measured, there's a real opportunity to have, like you said, Fons, is you have the best of both.
Yes.
And kind of have organizations reemerge and better and stronger.
Yeah, and it's what parents do this call the sandbox paradigm. You put your children in the sandbox and you say you have all freedom, but don't go out of the sandbox, right? And it's a bit, liquidity is great, but if you don't have a vase to put it in, it evaporates, right? So it is the tough borders of a vase within which liquid gets the beauty of flexibility without being ever evaporated.
So interesting. A lot to think about here.
You need metaphors because, you know, the worst that ever happened to us are models like Myers-Briggs, where if you score high on thinking, you score low on feeling. What kind of bullshit is that? Because if you're thinking without feeling, you're a robot. And if you're feeling without thinking, you're a neurotic or French. Now, I think that great leaders are leaders that connect their feelings with their thinking. And that is what Carl Jung wrote about. And then you get, let's go bipolar again. You're either, and then you give you letters, ISTJ, you know. In other words,
well, I think that's a perfect lead in to what I suspect that thank you for that that Jim will talk about, who also, like you, is a big thinker and looks to kind of knock down or reconstruct and build new paradigms because the old ones don't work anymore.
Thanks, Susan. So I'm going to argue that the pandemic has turbocharged three trends: digital transformation, mobile centricity, and AI-centric business models. And Dell Computer has 165,000 employees, and they have said that 50% of them are never going to come back to the office. So what are the implications for mobility as a profession if leading companies around the world are saying we have been forced to learn how to work remotely during the pandemic? We never wanted to do this. We prevented people from working from home. And now we've been forced to do it, and we've learned that it can actually work. Do you know in North America, the average worker spends 200 hours a year in traffic jams commuting to and from work? Is there nothing better we can do with 5 work weeks of our time every single year? So we have to look at the permanent structural changes that this pandemic has driven. 50% of the hospital and medical visits in China were remote by smartphone, right? Telehealth, like the industry prevented telehealth from happening. Like, who really wanted to go sit in your doctor's office with other people coughing and rashes for an hour waiting to see the doctor for 5 minutes, right? Like, it was insane. But the barriers were so strong that they prevented the society and the industry from changing. So Henry Mintzberg, who's a strategist, said, when the world is predictable, you need smart people. When the world is unpredictable, you need adaptable people. And that's what we need today. We need smart people. Don't misunderstand me. But I know so many smart people who said, this thing will be over in 2 weeks, so we're not going to change. this thing will be over in 2 months. We're not going to change. Like here we are a year later, and I still hear people, we're going to physically get together. Have you not heard there's 7 variants like to COVID, and some of them are resistant to the vaccines? Like, hello, we better get, like, if it's a whole year into this thing and you're still saying the end is just around the corner, wake up.
Mhm.
So we have to change. Do you know that Zoom is worth more than every airline, like the top 10 airlines of 2019 by revenue? Zoom is worth more. Like Zoom had 10 million users in December of 2019, 300 million now. I know some organizations that say you can't use Zoom, it's not secure.
Mhm.
To me, that's idiotic. That's like saying a financial institution saying you can't use the telephone because there's an operator. You know, there used to be operators who'd pull a plug out of this and put it into a board there. Like they could listen in on the phone call. You can't use the telephone because it's insecure. Like when 1 billion people are using Zoom, might financial institutions say, well, maybe we should reach our customers the way they want to be reached. We need to question these wisdom of the industry, because the world is a different world than it was when this industry wisdom was created. Retail, you look at the supply chain of people, let's look at the supply chain of goods. It took retail 10 years to grow by 11%. Like in 2009, it was 5% in the US, and by 2019, it was 16, okay? 10 years to grow 11%. During the pandemic, it grew 11% in 90 days. Okay, so we are seeing, and that's my time, we are seeing 10 years of change in 90 days. And companies are saying, we're just going to wait it out. Like, we need to change at the rate of the environment changing. And that means we need to hypercharge our transformation, how fast as organizations we change.
So thank you for that, Jim. And you've once said something that has really stuck with me, and that is to think the unthinkable. And I think that's an underlying theme of what all 3 of you have talked about. So I'm just going to move on to our second question, starting with Fons. In your view, what will the global workforce of tomorrow look like, and what skills will be critical?
Okay. Now, I think Jim and Diane have already touched upon what will happen with the global workforce. First of all, the definition of global needs to change in transnational. And why I'm saying it, because, first of all, global in German means superficial. And perhaps that's not the solution to what we need to go to. But there is something that was done about 20 years ago, research by Ghoshal and Bartlett, and they distinguished 4 types of organizations, and they need different type of workforces. You have the multi-local firm, like originally the big 4, the accountancy firms, legally and even economically, they were local. The only thing, and I'm exaggerating on purpose, the only thing they shared was the logo. And they had enormous trouble in dealing with international clients, because this is not on our budget, is it? And where is the income going? So that's multi-local. Then you have the global force, where very often Europeans say, oh, typically American, they come into Europe and do the same as they did in America. And then they complain why it didn't work in France. And I very often say, don't worry, nothing works in France, except the wonderful perfumes. Now, by the way, my mother is French, Diane. So
I knew you were speaking from experience, but yes, there are some good things that come out of France. It should help.
If you love people, you may criticize them. So the global firm is the firm that standardizes everything. It's the opposite from multi-local. And I have good news for you, both don't work. The compromise is the international firm, and the international firm is the firm that does slight adaptations locally. But that's not good enough. We need the transcultural or transnational firm, and there are 4 characteristics. First of all, they have shared values. But the shared values are yin and yang values. I'll come back to that in a second. Very interesting. Second characteristic is that they are polycentric. So they don't have a big center office in Detroit or Rotterdam or Paris, right? No, like Motorola, by the way, was very interesting. They had multi little centers. And the name for this is Centers of Excellence. They have, thirdly, a keen interest to learn locally, combine the best local practices into next practices, and then globalize them. Okay? And then finally, they have a shared leadership model called servant leadership. Servant leadership, Greenleaf, is a leadership model that just has one dictum. How can I enable others to perform better? And the model is very simple. Every father and mother is a servant leader. You are there for making your children perform better. That means, by the way, you're not weak. You can hit them. You can be severe. And the next time you play the horse and they're on your back, right? So a servant leader plays with top down and bottom up. That's the only leadership model that works in all cultures. All the big icons in religion, all the big icons in politics that we all love worldwide are servant leaders. Okay? Mandela, 27 years of jail. What was the first thing he said coming out of jail? What can I do for South Africa? Rather than how can we kill these bloody whites that put me into jail, right? All the icons in religion, from Jesus Christ to Mohammed, Buddha, they were all servant leaders. They were there to make their citizens perform better. And one final comment, because this means the type of people that we need in the future, is that they live in non-bipolar worlds. They try to combine up, and very often, and I'll give you an example, which is lovely. They use yin and yang values. I came to a Canadian Montreal-based company called CDPQ, Caisse de dépôt de placement de Quebec. 400 million investments, US dollars, 400 billion, big company. And they said, Ms. Trompenaars, can you help us? We read an article and you helped us, but we're stuck. That's very often, by the way, people who read my articles. And they said, we had 3 values that killed our company. Now, who's against the value? They had 3 values: innovation, ambition, and collaboration. Ambition meant that we, as an investment fund, pension fund, took too many risks. Innovation meant we didn't understand our own products. And collaboration meant we couldn't hold nobody accountable. And the head of their HR group said, Ms. Trompenaars, she showed me 3 pictures of 3 elevators. On one door, it said ambition. On the other door, it said prudence. On one door, it said innovation. On the other door, it said rigor. On one door, it said collaboration. The other door, it said individual accountability. I said, Mr. Trompenaars, you need to help us to make our people behave in a way that they can say, what can I do with ambition that makes us more prudent? Or what can I do with prudence that makes us more ambitious? Now, that is a counterintuitive thought, but that will work in every society. It's only the order in which you ask the question that is different. So the Germans would start with prudence and then go for ambition. The Americans would go for ambition and then be prudent, right? And the CEO, and in my last example, said, I'm non-executive director of Cirque du Soleil in Quebec, in Montreal. And the people in the trapeze didn't want to take more risks because they were scared. The only thing that helped them is to make them head of the new safety nets. When they designed the new safety nets, they took more risks. So prudence can help you to take more risks. And that is the mindset that we need in the future mobile workforce, because once you have yin and yang values, it works in every culture. Thanks.
So thank you, Fons. You had me at the elevator anecdote, and I'm thinking build a new elevator. So don't take the one on the right, don't take the one on the left, build a new one. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Jim, thank you.
So I like to start with a question. What are people capable of? You know, I've seen organizations where people couldn't buy a package of paper clips without getting authorization from someone else. And yet, what do we achieve outside work? We negotiate million-dollar mortgages. So is there some latent potential we're not tapping, like Dr. Evil, right? So how do we get at that? And organizations are structured in such a way that they're rule-bound, which actually prevents or kills innovation and flexibility, which is what we need during this pandemic. You know, I asked the question about Wikipedia, who's in charge? And do you know that Wikipedia has 300 million hours of volunteer time contributed to it? So who is making those people contribute to the organization? And it is a mission, it is a vision that all knowledge should be free for everyone in the world. It is such a compelling mission that it elicits the contribution of 300 million hours of volunteer time. So there's this notion of discretionary effort, which is the minimum performance required in an organization to not get fired, and the maximum an individual can contribute. And that delta, that difference, is the discretionary effort. And how do we pull on the discretionary efforts of people? It is by having a superordinate mission. I used to represent a guy called Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And having a mission was central to Stephen's vision of what made people successful and an organization successful. Another organization I work with is exponential organizations. These are companies that grow 10 times faster than traditional companies. What is it that drives a company to grow 10x the rate of its industry peers? It is a superordinate mission to transform the world that is inspiring to people. And then freedoms within that sandbox that Fons was talking about to innovate. In other words, innovation actually paradoxically loves constraint. You can do anything you want, but you can't spend more than $500,000. Like you can, so we actually need to give people that vase to innovate within. Like, what are the parameters? You know, you can do, and people get bigger vases as they innovate more successfully in their organization. Large successful organizations often begin as small ones. I interviewed a guy called James Gosling when he worked at Sun Microsystems for one of my books. And he was tasked with creating Java. Now, this was at Sun Microsystems, which was a company that focused on proprietary software. And Java allowed software to work between operating systems. So this was an anathema to the culture of Sun. And when I interviewed him, he said, I took a dozen super smart people and we went off site. And I said, why did you go off site? He said, because otherwise the corporate antibodies would have got me. Like they would have killed our innovation. In other words, organizations actually kill innovation because they're designed with their silos, like accounting or, you know, like the CFO or compliance department or the regulatory people will say, no, we can't do that. There's liability in the legal, right? No, we can't do it. Like we can't have, people driving or working virtually because, it goes against this or that, or the office department wants to, put furniture in an office. That's our job. You have to have an office because we're the furniture people. So all these silos are actually preventing innovation. So how do we get an organization that's focused on the superordinate goal of creating the best user experience?
That's great, Jim, and thank you. And I really like the visual, the metaphor of the vase, and get a bigger vase as innovation and successful innovation occurs, risk-taking occurs, and get a bigger vase. So innovation within constraints. So again, that's going back to that yin and yang, and you and Fons kind of wove through those two themes very well together. I'm going to turn to Diane and also being mindful of time.
Yeah, I will. I'll be hopefully quick. So I'm going to bring this into more of like an employee and somebody in HR as an employer focus on workforce. One, I do not think we're going to have everybody working from home. One of the things I cringe at, like chalks on a nails on a chalkboard, is when people say, well, we've all worked from home now, so we know we can do it. Well, we've had to work from home, because that's also like saying, oh, well, I haven't gone out to a restaurant in a year, so I don't have to do, so we can get rid of all the restaurants, or I haven't traveled on a vacation away in a year. So I don't need, that's something I can cut out. So we can't decide in this moment in time, because hopefully this moment in time is short or long, whichever half glass half full is lived. So I think the workforce is this is just going to be another way companies have to adapt to the way people work. Some people want to be in the office all the time. Some people want to be home all the time. Some people want the hybrid. So I think it's, as an employee or looking at a job, you're going to have another level of evaluating a company. I think as an employer, you have to be prepared for all these types of workforces, and each employer is different as well. We can't have, we did have retail people that worked from home and did a lot of training, but long term, that doesn't work. They have to be there. Corporate people maybe can be offsite much more. IT people can be offsite much more. Contracting companies, you obviously have to be there. So every company is going to be different. It's going to be a hybrid. I do think there does have to be a little bit more flexibility, and I keep using that word, but we're creating a flex time situation, which now a lot of companies have said, we're going to do it. It's next year. It's next year. I think now companies saying we have to do it now, because when we all come back, we have to be prepared. I don't think there's going to be, every company is going to be the work from everywhere, because we know that has restraints. We know that has risks. And I do think there'll be some more tax rules. My hot take is I think the tax rules are going to change if people do start working from everywhere. I think countries are going to realize, wait, this person's working for the US entity, but living in Paris. They're resident in Paris, but yet they're doing work. I should be getting my taxes too. So I do think as countries start saying, look, we need to recoup some of this money, they're going to start trying to hybrid the tax rules. And I think that'll make it messier. But again, it will make it more, hopefully global mobility will stand out more. But I just don't think we can decide in this moment in time, but I do think it's just going to be, again, a hybrid of everything coming together. Like there isn't going to be this polarization of work from home all the time or work in the office all the time.
And I think you make a great point, Diane, is tax and compliance will likely be the next, or be the disruption, and from that innovation will occur. So it looks like we have a number of questions here. So in lieu of going to our third question, I'm hoping that as you three respond to the questions, perhaps you could weave in question number 3, which is, what lessons can we learn about embracing disruption and driving innovation from outside the global mobility industry. And I know Fons and Jim, you specifically have spoken to that, and let's relate that back to those on the call and pull through those themes. I'd like to turn it over to our friend Tain from EuRA, who's managing the Q&A.
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, everybody, for your contributions. It's been an absolute pleasure. So I would love to just go through some of the questions that are coming. One is a very sort of descriptive one, which is, can you just elaborate, Fons, on the difference between IQ and EQ? That's from Teresa.
Yeah, interesting. We have taken IQ and EQ as a dilemma. IQ is the rational cognitive side of us. EQ is obviously the emotional side. It links to our neutral versus affective dimension of culture. And what we have found is, for example, when we in the Netherlands were closing the schools, there was a big discussion, should also primary schools be closed? And the government said, yeah, and I'm talking about April last year, so it was the first wave, and not a lot of knowledge, but the knowledge they then had was, no, we can keep the primary schools open because the young kids don't get very ill and they're not so infectious. So we keep them open. Then EQ came in, not based on any rational arguments, that the parents said, oh, well, what are you doing? And by the way, the teacher association said, now teachers, and what we found in this dilemma is that people who are rational are right, but don't get it. Emotional people are not right, but they get it. What we found in this dilemma is that emotions always win. And we have found it we call it demagogy, the people who talk easy about all these problems and go to the heart of people, but very often have very little brain. That dilemma has been resolved by what we call an intelligent lockdown. And we have seen that and let me give you one last example how to reconcile it. We had this triage. I don't know if that's the good word in English, but if there are not enough beds, who do you put on it? And you can have rational arguments, and you can have emotional arguments. The issue, and I think in the Netherlands they did it greatly, because the doctor said, we don't know what to do because there are so many factors and so many rational arguments and so many emotional arguments so they put all kinds of disciplines together with emotional people, with rational people, with professors, with lay people. And they came up with an agreement on the criteria according to which a doctor had to make the decision. And we only needed it for a couple of moments, but it worked perfectly. And that's a reconciliation of IQ and EQ. Let people go in dialogue and come up with a final result. Obviously, we need both. It's a bit what Jim said earlier, quoting Ginsberg, knowledge versus adaptability is one of those other dilemmas. And adaptability very often comes by gut feel and not by logical deduction. So you need both. That's my long answer to a short question.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you. And I mean, Diane, from that point of view as well, from somebody who's at the sort of cutting edge of talent management, that must be a pretty key dynamic for you when you were thinking about the organizational structure of Chanel. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think it's, we have people that, but every company has it. We do have more of a French culture, but we do have people that think very linear, very, I need to understand the next step. And it's been very difficult, obviously, for those people. But some are just, we can do this for this person and that for that person, which then says, wait a minute, we have to have some structure within HR. We can't treat people too differently, even though they're different. So yeah, I think the IQ and EQ always are at battle. I think there's a very, there are some in the middle, as Fons, to your point earlier, it's not always one or the other. And I think those are the people that can make it a little bit more difficult to make decisions, but that's because they're thinking emotionally and intellectually, making sure they kind of then bring that all in together. So. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you.
For the French, if you allow, there is a book written a long time ago when I did my PhD by Michel Crozier, and it's called Le Phénomène bureaucratique. Because the French can be enormously bureaucratic at the moment you don't know them. At the moment you know them, it's over. You know, and it's wonderful, this dilemma within, especially the French. They have Cartesian thought, very deductive, logical, but then you go on the emotional side and they are indeed close to extreme emotional.
I want to jump in on this, and I have a kind of rhetorical question. Who's closest to the future? The 65-year-old CEO who doesn't know how to print off his emails, so has his assistant do it, or the 18-year-old who's on Tinder? Who does all the strategic planning? Who is most disenfranchised from strategic planning? Is it any wonder we only get incremental change in organizations? And so I don't want to be ageist, you know, just to suggest because you have gray hair or no hair, you can't be driving change. When he was CEO of General Electric, Jack Welch was rated as the best CEO by other CEOs, but he knew nothing about the internet. So he had some 20-somethings come in and mentor him every week on the internet. It's called reverse mentoring. So if you're leading an organization, do you have a reverse mentor of some 20-something who's showing you what their life is right now and how they are consuming? You know, I'm on TikTok, let's say. Well, if I'm Chanel, do we market via TikTok? No, because we're all, you know, 50 plus. And like, who the hell's like, what's the value of TikTok? But unless you have a shadow board, like we have a board of directors, do you have a shadow board? Like of millennials and Gen Zs who, you know, you roll out your capital spending plan and they say, that's brain dead. You know, why don't we just do this for free? And rather than spend millions on this sunk cost. So what are the systemic structures in the organization that ensure you're always going to be relevant and adapting at the speed of change? It shouldn't just be happenstance. You know, Deming said it's systems and structures that govern. So what systems and structures do we have that ensure we are relevant in a pandemic?
So interesting. And I'm just taking that back to the global mobility, you know, industry. Who's mentoring the mentors? And so, you know, thinking to what, you know, you, Fons, and you, Jim, and Diane have said, you know, as we look at our organizations today to restart, to rethink, to reimagine, is not make general assumptions about whether it's age, whether it's title, whether it's seniority, is to find mentoring, as well as I love the concept of reverse mentoring opportunities that benefits your organization, your collaboration, your purpose, as well as your retention, as well, and your growth strategy. So thank you.
Susan, one example, since you know, I'm at an age that I say a smaller organization is fine. We have 3 people on the payroll, but 5 interns. And I can tell you, if you digitalize, you better have 5 interns. Fantastic. It's fantastic. You know, it's reverse mentoring. I learned so much from them. And they learn a lot from me in complete other ways. And to quote Ginsberg, you have the grand strategy from the 65-year-old CEO. You have the emerging strategy from the 18-year whiz-kid. But what we need is a crafting strategy which combines the two. You need the vase, which is the ground strategy. Within you have the liquid. And then as a result, you have the flower. My God, I love metaphors.
Love it, love it. So Dom, it looks like we have several other questions there.
We do. Jim, this is from Priya. Hi, Priya. Thank you for this. Do you think innovation and disruption can happen only if organizations trust their employees to work well from home and not micromanage? Because, she says, micromanagement is an organizational trend we're seeing during the pandemic.
So this is a great question, Priya. The reason we have hierarchical structures is lack of trust. So they come to us from the military, from the Roman Empire, where, you know, it's a command and control structure, and the really smart people are at the top, and all information flows up, and they make all the decisions, and we just execute. But if we go back to that paperclip versus $1 million mortgage issue, what are people really capable of? How do we create a vase of principles, like you're empowered to make a, you know, $50,000 or $500,000 decision, but unless you have to do it immediately, it would be a very good idea to consult with other people in the organization, right? So how do we create a set of not rules, but principles about decision making? Like if the house is burning down, you don't have to consult other people. You can just rush in. If not, you know, how do we optimize, not just for my silo, like legal, how do we optimize for the mission and vision of the entire organization? Which means there are no rules. There are principles of effective decision-making. So how do we change from being a rule-based organization, which is limiting, to a principle-based organization? This is very challenging.
Yeah, and I think you bring up some really great points, Jim, where I will challenge it. And I think to Diane's point, you know, tax and compliance, that's frankly a fact of life. Doesn't mean it can't be disrupted, and it's being disrupted now, and innovation as a result of that disruption will undoubtedly be born out of that. So, you know, again, it comes back to in my experience is, you know, have the vase, mix up the disruption from that innovation will happen. The flower will grow. Yes, Tom, the flower will grow. There needs to be process as well.
There's a lovely quote from Rob Fletcher. Thank you for that. Coco Chanel's favorite quote. If you were born without wings, do nothing to prevent them from growing, which I think is fab. Thanks. And also Rob asked the question, which I guess is to all of you. How do you deal with clients who want safe when you're trying to be different and disruptive? Jim, I'll give that one to you first.
Well, you know, it's a bit of a paradox. We want everyone to innovate, but you can't do anything different. So, you know, you know, there are ways to do this, which is the Sun Microsystems way, which is you create these little entities that are on the edge or outside the mothership of the organization. And they tinker and toy and innovate, but with very few resources. So they don't put at risk the, you know, profit engine and structure of the mothership. But over time, some of these little innovations can get to be as large or even more valuable than the mothership. But we need to innovate at the edges of the organization where legal and compliance can't shut it down. It's, for instance, Airbnb, you know, has exceeded the number of rooms of the Marriott, which is the largest hotel chain in the world. And it is more flexible during the pandemic because nobody's traveling, nobody's staying in hotels. But if I'm Airbnb, I have already pivoted to selling experiences, not just physical locations you stay in. So if you were to go stay in Provence in the stone farmhouse from Chef Hébert, and it's not in lockdown, Fons has stayed there. Chef Hébert takes you to the kitchens of 3 of his chef friends who are 2 or 3-star Michelin rated, and you sit at the chef's table with Chef Hébert while his buddy serves you. So it's not just that you're staying in his stone farmhouse, it's that you're getting an experience. So we can double our market if it's not just about a room. Now, the Marriott, can you imagine the general manager taking you home to serve you pierogies? You know, like the Marriott, it's totally outside its box. So how do we pivot to enable us when our core business has been crushed by COVID? How do we pivot to do something else?
And that's
Yeah, you know, you bring up an interesting point of, if I could just one moment, Dom, about the customer experience. And there's been so much conversation in the mobility industry about the customer experience. That too has been disrupted. So I'd be curious if I could just ask a question of Diane. As you relook at the customer experience now, has that changed post, or will that change post-COVID?
I don't think drastically. Even before, remember before COVID, I always use an analogy of what we do is, if we took 40 different people and moved them from New York to London, which is arguably one of the biggest routes in global mobility, we'd still have 40 different things that we would have to adapt. Some people have, their dog is the most important. Some are single, some are married, some have kids, there's school, there's location, there's precious painting. There's all these different things that we deal with in global mobility that are important, so we have to adapt to all of them. I actually had the experience of moving 40 different people from New York to London, and it is the case. Everybody has a different priority. So I think in that sense, where it's maybe looking at the end user and saying, what do they expect? I think the expectations are still there. I think there's going to have to be some ramp up for RMCs. I don't think they haven't had to deal with as many people. I think they've had to deal with different situations, but I think there's almost going to have to be a retraining of, hey, remember, things could go smoothly and things can actually work. You have to actually work with the employee because their expectations are much higher than they are now. But I just, I think, again, it's tough, and maybe it's just because I tend to be like a little bit more adaptable, and we've, the original question of how do we see, be innovative but structured. I think that does happen a lot. Again, bringing it way down versus a corporate experience into global mobility, is we see that. We say, look, an exception might only be $500, but it's also could be precedent setting. So you have to have that flexibility. It's not all just, you can make an exception for this amount of dollars, because if it's a big precedent setting exception, it could cost you $1 million in the end. And vice versa, like, are things, by the time we go back and forth over something that's $150, between all the hours everybody spent on it, you've spent more, you've spent more in energy of the employee as salary than you did in the situation. So I think there has to be structure, but then that other open piece. And one company, we used to talk about global consistency a lot in the way we administered global mobility. And at one point I just said, look, we are globally consistent by being globally inconsistent. We're I mean, you have to have regional interests. You have to have some structure. I always say our policies, which I hate that word, or instead of an 80-20 rule, they're more like a 40-60 rule, because of you're dealing with family and everything else. So I think global mobility is a good way of saying, you got to be ready for change, but you have to have that overlying guideline.
Mm-hmm. So to your point, Diane, instead of policy, framework.
Right.
Framework. So Dom has graciously given us a couple extra minutes, and we have a good number of people still on the call.
A lot of questions. I think probably, Susan, if it's okay, I'm going to just thank everybody who's put questions in, but there are two that really stand out for me. One of which I kind of have to address from the point of view of the fact that everybody who's a DSP in the audience wants to know this. And I'm sorry, Diane, but this is for you. From Jesper Lovendahl. Thank you so much. Diane, you mentioned that you'd gone direct to relevant suppliers because the RMCs didn't necessarily have the answers you were seeking. Have you seen benefits in going direct? And will you in-house more suppliers going forward? Or will you go back to the pre-COVID models of RMC supply?
I wouldn't say RMCs don't have the answer. I think it's one of RMCs work perfectly for our company. We don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the manpower, we don't have the technology to be able to manage all the pieces involved with relocation. The downside of a RMC, not any RMC, is you have this chain of communication. So you go to one person, they have to go to another person, then they come back, and then you have another question, and then it's just this. And when you need, so going directly, we still managed in-house our immigration. So going directly to immigration provider, same thing with tax, they're our tax provider. But as far as all the other services, that's what we do through the RMC.
Sure.
But I do find, and there's times when I say, can't we just get everybody on the phone, even with my RMC, because then we can have the banter. There's too many emails, there's too many questions back and forth, so that it still gets to be focused. I like to deal with the people that are actually doing the work, but as far as this is the same thing that we just talked about, you have to have a structure, but you have to be able to adapt to that if something comes up. So I love that our RMC, we outsource all that. I love that we can do that, and that's what we need to do in our company. But there's times when it doesn't work because you have to go right to the direct person. So,
and thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for your candor. And I'm going to direct this, I think this goes to all of you, but I'm particularly to Fons. From Usha Raju, thank you so much for this. How do we manage cultural differences in a remote working environment where we don't see new employees face to face, only through the Zoom window?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's not easy because our old paradigm said, at least our old paradigm, that the best way to be digital is to go analog because it's the combination of both. Once you have met people, your email is read quite differently if you never met people. So I would say open communication channels. I see it now in my teaching and in our consulting. Just looking at a screen is not enough. So what you are doing, like a little Q&A and a little this and a little that, and put people in subgroups. Okay, 1 hour is a bit too short, but open communication channels. That would be my advice in short. It's not an easy one because a lot of research has been done by people on what they call low and high context cultures. If you go digital, it's much more lower context. But what I learned, for example, is if you have a Japanese talk and you say, I'll summarize it by email, or vice versa, you write the Japanese person an email and you say, by the way, I want to speak to you in half an hour on Zoom. That's opening communication channels. So they hear the tone of voice, they see your face, while an email is very bullet pointy type of stuff. But little things like using CC, I copy, so you make not one person losing face, but 20 others. And that is something that there is some basic literature on it. A colleague of ours her name is Hollema, and she just wrote a book on the cultural effects on virtual working. And she wrote it before Corona, but now it's obviously, there's another guy who wrote, just the book came out on the day Corona was exploding. And the book is called, Where is My Office?
No, not the cheese.
Yeah? He was once head of real estate of IBM, real estate meaning offices. And he said already before Corona, it's moving, but it's not an easy question. My simple answer is open communication channels.
Something Fons has just said triggered something for me. It's not a good idea to wait until a crisis hits to begin practicing flexibility and principle-based decision-making. In other words, the organizations that have most benefited from COVID were aligned with these trends before COVID hit. In other words, don't wait until you're thirsty to begin to dig a well. So we need to embrace this. The pandemic has shown us that digital transformation, mobile centricity, and AI being embedded in business processes being central to them are hypercharging those companies that had embraced those trends pre-COVID. And so in general, large organizations are too slow. So they are going to have to change structurally, internally, to be more agile, flexible, resilient, adaptable, innovative. Which means they're going to have to break down the barriers to those very things that exist structurally. And so you can't wait until the pandemic hits to start breaking those things down. You're just scrambling to survive.
So I'm respectful of everybody's time. EuRA, Dom has been more than gracious giving us some extra time. We are all available, and you can connect with any of us on LinkedIn. On behalf of Lauri Murphy, my co-host, always a pleasure collaborating with you. Speaking of collaboration, I thank you all for your interest, for sticking with us for the hour plus, and for your questions. This has been, as well as your comments. Thank you all to our speakers. Impossible is nothing. There's been a lot of common themes here, and thank you all, and big thank you to, of course, to Dom from EuRA Relocation Association.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to Jim and to Fons and to Diane. And just to let you know that the comments coming through the chat box are so positive. Everyone is so grateful for your time and your expertise. And just to let you all know, the session has been recorded. I'll be doing the edit of that tomorrow, and I will be sending it out to everybody, so you will be able to go back over it. But thank you again, Susan, for putting this together. Thank you to Lauri. But thank you most to Jim and to Fons and Diane. It's been so great to get your opinions and your expertise.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
A lot to think about.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Bye-bye.
Stay well.
Stay well.
Uh-huh.
Bye.